The honourable member for Thunder Bay Superior North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Liberal or NDP party have a chance to improve their environmental policies and, likely, their election chances. Prominent economists and policy advisors from across North America and the political spectrum have recommended carbon fee and dividend as a good way to slow the progress of climate change and the best way to price carbon. Even Preston Manning, one of Canada's most respected conservatives, has called for a price on carbon. Canadian CO2 emissions have been rising for years, no, we should say decades, under both the Conservatives and the Liberals. Stalling this issue into the future will only worsen our problem. Canada is one of the highest CO2 polluters per person in the world. We have an obligation to our children and our grandchildren to deal with this problem now. Environmental issues have often taken a back burner in Liberal and Conservative governments. For example, C-311, my climate change bill, is the only bill in Canadian history to be killed in our unelected Senate without any debate after passing the elected House of Commons. This government has made Canada the climate pariah of the world. Conservatives have completely ignored international agreements on climate change. Our Prime Minister even boycotted the 2014 United Nations Climate Solutions Summit in New York City. The Liberals, on the other hand, claimed they are ready to put a price on carbon, but not what kind, when, or how. Now, the Liberal leader has shown incredible lack of initiative or leadership by announcing that any kind of carbon pricing system should be left up to the provinces. Basically, it's somebody else's problem. Climate change is happening now and is having a very real consequence on people's lives. Climate change is disrupting national economies and ecologies. It is costing us here in Canada dearly today and even more tomorrow. Canada must implement a carbon fee and dividend policy. It's a simple, transparent, revenue-neutral carbon pricing system that would be easy and inexpensive to administer. Here's how it works, Mr. Speaker. Coal mines and oil and gas wells will pay for their CO2 emissions at the source or at the border, and not a penny will go to the government. The dividends generated from those payments will be paid directly back to Canadians on an equal per capita basis, thus reducing poverty and CO2 at the same time. Mr. Speaker, this is not a tax. Carbon fee and dividend will use the marketplace to reduce CO2 emissions, guide Canada toward a transition to sustainable energy, and put money into the pockets of Canadian consumers who make sustainable choices. The Conservatives and Liberals have no plan to reduce CO2. The NDP has a bad plan. The Green Party is committed to a carbon fee and dividend as proposed by the Citizens Climate Lobby under the dynamic leadership of Sudbury's Cathy Orlando. If this government wants to protect our economy and increase its election chances, it should waste no time in implementing carbon fee and dividend. So, Mr. Speaker, will the government seriously consider carbon fee and dividend? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under our Conservative government, the tax burden on Canadians is at the lowest level in more than 50 years. On average, Canadian families are paying $3,400 less in taxes each year than they were under the previous Liberals. In addition, every family with children in Canada will stand to benefit from our latest tax breaks, including the increase and expansion of the universal childcare benefit to nearly $2,000 per year for every child under 6 and $720 per year for every child between 6 and 17, and of course the family tax cut. The vast majority of these benefits, Mr. Speaker, will actually flow to low and middle income families. The Liberals and the NDP would take these benefits away and would increase taxes on Canadian families with a carbon tax. Our government has been very clear on this issue. It does not intend to address greenhouse gas emissions through a job-killing carbon tax as supported by the opposition parties. Instead, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to take decisive action on the environment while protecting our economy. In fact, our Conservative government is the first government in Canadian history to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we will continue to use our sector-by-sector regulatory approach to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I would also like to take the time to highlight that our government has already taken action on two of Canada's largest sources of GHG emissions, the transportation and electricity sectors. The transportation sector generates nearly 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions and has been one key area of focus for our government. Actually, it's been the key area for our government on our this focus of our government. We have moved in line, in fact, with the United States with new regulations for both light and heavy-duty vehicles. With these regulations, 2025 model year passenger vehicles and light trucks will emit about half as many greenhouse gas emissions as 2008 models. 2025 vehicles are also expected to consume up to 50% less fuel than 2008 vehicles. This will lead to significant savings at the pump for Canadians. Greenhouse gas emissions from 2018 model year heavy-duty vehicles will be reduced by up to 23%, which will also cut down on fuel costs. Furthermore, we have one of the cleanest electricity systems in the world, with 79% of electricity supply emitting no greenhouse gas emissions at all. With our government's coal-fired electricity regulations, Canada became the first major coal user to ban the construction of traditional coal-fired electricity generation units. The regulations also require the phase-out of existing coal-fired units without carbon capture. In the first 21 years, the regulations are expected to result in a cumulative reduction equivalent to removing 2.6 million personal vehicles per year from the roads over this time frame. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will continue to stand up for hardworking Canadians. Unlike the Liberals and the NDP and the other parties, we're focused on what matters to Canadians, supporting economic growth and protecting the environment, not raising taxes.
Member for Thunder Bay, Superior North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The lack of a Canadian energy strategy should be a top priority for Conservatives and us all. It's costing the Canadian economy billions every year and continues our dependence in Thunder Bay, Superior North, and all of Eastern Canada on sustainable, expensive, dangerous foreign oil. Most Canadians support pricing carbon. The Conservatives have so far chosen ideology over evidence and over the desires of most Canadians. Mr. Speaker, this member does not seem to even know what carbon fee and dividend is, and that it is not a tax. Carbon fee and dividend will reduce our CO2 emissions, support Canadian economic growth, put money into Canadians' pockets, and it could get the Conservatives re-elected. When will these Conservatives understand what carbon fee and dividend is and finally address climate change? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you. Our government will continue to move forward with its sector-by-sector approach. We are reducing emissions without a carbon tax, which would raise the price of everything. Given the chance, both the NDP and the Liberals have said they would introduce a carbon tax. This would kill jobs, raise the cost of gas, groceries, home heating, and just about everything else. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can count on this government to do exactly the opposite. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.